Next, we'll have Jamie Vanucci, who is actually one of a number of researchers on campus, and we even talk to each other every once in a while who are working on related subjects. So I'd like to welcome Jamie.
Hi, everybody. I'm an assistant professor in landscape architecture here at Cornell, so I hope you will take a few minutes to entertain a designer's perspective. I'm going to talk to you today about some research that I've been working on for the past 2.5 years, and then some research that's just now extending from that initial research. So I'm at the beginning of stages here, and like Suzanne, I'm probably going to have more questions than I know I don't have any answers, so I'm just going to put that out there right away. So I'd like to begin with the question, what is the value of a floodplain? For the past few years, I've been working with an interdisciplinary team to study buyouts and flood risk management in the upper Susquehanna watershed in the southern tier of New York State. I've been trying to gain a new perspective on what I see as a maligned and misunderstood landscape, the floodplain, a territory of disturbance, because the flood defines it, risk and uncertainty. So this is just a slide that shows our team. We have an interdisciplinary team of people, landscape architecture, communication and public health, state and regional planning, environmental science, I think that about covers it, biological and environmental engineering. And we were funded by federal capacity funds. So we began with the question of wanting to study buyouts, the buyout process, which we were just hearing rumors about how fraught it could be. For communities, especially local communities. But then we quickly learned that the knowledge transfer is often lacking, and therefore, as administrations change, the knowledge just vaporizes. And so we expanded our initial question from buyouts to be, how do communities in the upper Susquehanna watershed understand and manage flood risk? And so that's what we worked on for a few years. And that, of course, included discussions about the buyout process. And from there, we did a lot of mapping and drawing. I think one of the things that we learned is that interviews are a critical part of the process. We interviewed people from the municipal, county, state, regional, and federal levels to hear diverse perspectives of those tasked with managing flood risk in these communities. And now we're undertaking field work to understand the floodplain as a unique landscape. So for those of you who don't know it, the Susquehanna, while appearing idyllic in the photo on the left, is hydrologically notorious, with a major flood every 14 years, annual flash flooding, ice jams, and property damage, coupled with fairly common severe drought conditions that can have dramatic effects on low flow conditions, even within the basin's main stem river. I think you probably heard the term a mile wide and a foot deep. That is what's used often to describe the Susquehanna. Our study communities are shown here, along with the projected change in precipitation over the next few decades. Unlike incremental and predictable trends in rising sea levels, inland communities can't predict when the next big storm will occur, although most people we've interviewed agree that the storm magnitude and frequency seem to be changing. Models call for storms of increasing intensity, along with extended periods of drought. Coastal urban areas receive lots of attention, especially after large events such as Hurricane Sandy. These areas have high populations, incremental sea level rise, large high-profile infrastructure projects, and therefore they do grant that attention. But in contrast, our study communities are inland, riverine, small, and largely rural. They have different development pressures, if any development pressure. They have economic growth and population trajectories that are much different than coastal communities. In addition, they're experiencing increasingly hard to predict storms in the form of highly intensive cloud bursts affecting very small areas, or tropical storms that stall out and dump heavy rains over large areas. So this is just some of the mapping we've done. We're trying to get a more nuanced sense of what defines the floodplain. So here you see the maps that we typically see, the FEMA 1% annual chance and 0.2% annual chance flood. And then we've added to that some other factors that could be used to define floodplain. And so you see here the fluvial soils that were at one time transported by the river. And you can see the historic floodplain for this area in Binghamton, New York, is much larger than the existing modeled flood area. And that's because of levees and other infrastructure. And then we add to that this sort of what I would call the factual, right? These are storm events, areas that were inundated in 2006 and 2011 when two major storms occurred. And so putting all that together, you get a kind of more nuanced description of what defines the floodplain as this territory. Our other research, this is student work, has looked at the existing vegetation. So trying to get a sense of what's out there, like what is this floodplain? What's the current use in these areas? And so this is the vegetative communities that you might find within the floodplain area. And recently we've been doing these field studies. So just going out to different sites that we pinpoint within the floodplain area and trying to get a sense of what these mean experientially, or how they're connected to the community or not in some cases. Okay, so relocating homeowners from floodplain properties, as several of my fellow panelists have discussed, is a voluntary process. And when some neighbors choose to stay and others leave, the neighborhood fabric is left with multiple gaps. Municipal governments are still responsible for maintaining infrastructure like streets and sidewalks. Those we interviewed often agreed that buyouts were a good idea to move people out of harm's way permanently, but complained that the process takes too long, often lacks transparency, and that particular groups of homeowners can be hard to serve. This fall, we've been turning our attention to what happens after the buyout, when the often lengthy process is complete and the homes have been demolished. What happens to these lots in the short and long term? We've been going out to each address, thanks to the recently released FEMA database of buyouts across the US, to see what is happening there. And this is just a quick frame of that database imported to Google Earth and looking at some homes or some buyout locations in Vestal, New York. So here's a sampling of what we found so far in the communities of Vestal and Owego. Lawn. As you can see, there's not a lot of variation from lot to lot. And in my experience, parks departments are typically very short-staffed and low on funding, but they're now often tasked with maintaining these parcels scattered throughout the community. These are some from Owego. It's important to note that buyout funding sources come with restrictions specific to the source for what can be done with these parcels. For example, the town of Union stopped using FEMA money because they didn't want to restrict redevelopment. And loss of tax base is a concern mentioned by all of our municipal interviewees. Using a document published by FEMA in 1994, we did a quick assessment of a typical buyout lot given a list of floodplain values. So FEMA produced this document, the Unified National Program for Floodplain Management, and they discussed a number of values and functions that floodplains provide. And so just looking at, this lot, 232 Green Lawn Road in Vestal, New York, and thinking about which of these values are provided in that space. And so I was actually kind of surprised to see that water resources, you can see this category down below. I don't have a pointer, but the black line stretching across. Almost all the water resource categories are present on this lot. Things like flood storage, reducing flood velocities, infiltration, sedimentation. Even with lawn, these services would be provided. Things like biological resources, things like maintaining biodiversity or ecosystem integrity, providing habitat for waterfowl, these are almost entirely lacking. And then societal, we have some, I didn't see anybody out on any of these buyout lots, but we only visited so far for 2 days, so that may change. But basically, there's very low societal use as well. So a good precedent for what is possible is the Floodplains by Design project in Washington State. Here you can see a fairly broad set of possibilities for floodplains, including recreation and water access, habitat creation, and agricultural uses. The dispersed nature of buyout parcels can make floodplain reconnection challenging, but proposed use for buyout properties may be a significant factor in decision-making of property owners when considering a buyout. Liz Kozloff, a researcher that I think she's at MIT now. I don't remember. Where is she? Los Angeles, okay, way off. She did some extensive research working with communities along the eastern shore of Staten Island that Jane was just mentioning after Hurricane Sandy. She found that many people were willing to give up their home if they knew the land was going to contribute to larger community good, in that case, restored wetlands to provide a buffer for storm surge. Incentivizing buyouts makes a difference, and this can be seen also in places like North Carolina. And by the way, none of our municipalities who had been conducting buyouts had thought about incentives. And so that is, I think, a big area where we should be looking into further. So the community rating system offers points for communities undertaking floodplain planning and projects to restore natural floodplain function. This incentive is difficult for some communities, at least so far, as conducting buyouts and hazard mitigation planning is already taxing for small communities with limited capacity for planning and often lacking technical assistance. But you can see some of these here. I sort of bolded the things that you could do on buyout parcels, and then there's also a design and planning category, policy category, and then things like outreach to communities. And this is a substantial amount of points toward the community rating system, which could be thought about. All communities participating in the National Flood Insurance Program, as you know, have to have a hazard mitigation plan. Communities commonly struggle to implement the actions proposed in these plans and usually cite lack of available funding for pre-hazard mitigation. We wonder if this predominant issue might be addressed by connecting hazard mitigation planning, often done by engineers, to comprehensive planning for cities, often done by planners. A quick review of our study area communities comprehensive planning document shows this connection could be strengthened. And you see, like even a year or two after some major floods that have occurred in some of these communities, the word flood is mentioned only once in some of these documents. So there's clearly a disconnect there. And we think putting those two things together could help. So to conclude, source of funding and plans for post-buyout use situated within larger plans for communities and regions, especially those that factor in changes in climate and precipitation regimes, are key factors in determining the kinds of functions that these parcels can provide. So I want to just conclude with the question, and maybe we can talk about this together, or the panelists. How do we move from floodplains as landscapes of risk to landscapes of multiple kinds of value for communities? And I just want to finish with this slide, which shows a buyout parcel in Johnson City with a sign. I don't know why. I still need to talk to people here to determine why they feel the need to put this no trespassing sign. And then we have on the right side is silver maple floodplain forest, which is one of the predominant land cover types in the floodplain. Extremely beautiful. And another point I want to mention is that many people, when they think about the floodplain, like oftentimes on a map, it'll show up as blue. And there's a couple of reasons why that's wrong. One is that it's not wet. Most of the floodplain is quite dry. It's really these areas that are right along rivers that are wet or that are, wetland based. And the other thing is floodwater is not blue, right? As we know, floodwater comes with lots of pollutants and issues. So I think, there's a lot of room here to do a better job with some of this stuff. Thank you.
Thank you. Before we start, I'd like to see a show of hands of how many people are from communities that have experienced significant flooding in the past 20 years. Okay, you all live in New York, right? How about Sam was highlighting some other kinds of climate-related issues, including particularly heat stress and vulnerable populations in communities. How many of you are in places where that's potentially a significant issue? Also a lot of hands. Okay, I only did that to get you thinking about your own communities and try and bring them into the conversation that we're about to have. Because again, we want to hear from you as well as some questions that you may have for the panelists. And also Jamie posed a question to us right at the end. So this is kind of your time now.
Hi, my name is Ian Gabi. I'm from the city of Binghamton. So something that I noticed was that we talked a lot about some of the solutions potentially for buyouts being demolitions. And some of the issues that were talked about as well were like property tax revenues and issues with property owners, being reluctant to participate potentially in the program. But we haven't really talked a lot about potential tenants who might be living in those properties and renting. So I was in charge of carrying out the Binghamton buyout, the city of Binghamton. And something that we noticed was that a lot of the people who were living in these flood-prone areas were on the lower spectrum in terms of income. And one of the issues that we ran into was the problem of relocating individuals. They might not have, none of them really had any capital in order to invest in an entirely new space. So that usually required security deposit, first month's rent. And there was a provision under FEMA guidelines. There was the Uniform Relocation Assistance, URA, but that did not cover the cost of first month's rent and security deposit. So I just wanted to find out from you guys what solutions potentially did any of you people run into this, or was how would you go about strategizing this potentially?
Yeah, I guess across any sort of disaster recovery program, renters are probably the biggest issue to deal with because they don't get to make that decision, right? It's to participate in a disaster, especially a federally funded disaster recovery program, the decision is that the building structure owner. So both in our buyout and acquisition program, as well as in our single family homeowner program, it is really hard to help current renters. We have built new rental buildings, but if you're currently renting and your home was damaged and the homeowner doesn't want to participate, then you're still living in a damaged home. Or if they do participate, then you're losing your home. So we have not solved that issue. We have utilized the URA program. We have been able to, especially if they're permanently relocated, as in the case of our buyout program, we have been able to provide a significant amount of funding. We're able to provide security, as well as, I think it's like 15 months rent of what that would be. So again, we haven't been able to go back and see how they are currently living, but it's not a problem we've solved, but that's how we utilize it in our program. We use URA. We also added some additional incentives to help renters. Again, though, we have $4.6 billion to work with. So that's definitely not something that can necessarily be replicated.
Actually, I was wondering, this is loud, whether anybody's ever thought about even developing like a renter's insurance program or something for like lower income people who might have to live in those type of sort of disaster areas. Because that would seem to me like if there was some sort of either subsidized insurance, like there's flood insurance for homeowners, and you can get renter's insurance, but I'm not sure that it right now would cover that kind of disaster.
Before you answer, if there's not a clear response to that one already, this is like a great idea to bring into the final session to strategize about. But anybody want to respond to that one?
Can I also tag team onto that question? So I think the insurance piece is really important. I got inspired, and a couple of my colleagues got really inspired in this work on perception of flood risk when we read an article in The Nation by Virginia Eubanks, who is a professor at RPI, but also a resident of Troy. And she was talking about climate change and the impact on older, vulnerable neighborhoods in Troy. And so the growing wealth gap, particularly the racialized wealth gap. So you have a lot of people of color living downtown who may actually own their home if they've paid off the mortgage or they inherited the property. They don't hold a mortgage. They don't have to have flood insurance. But if they don't have flood insurance, they're not going to be covered. So there's even more vulnerable that this sort of spatialized risk was also racialized, and drawing attention to what the role of municipality is in protecting those particular neighborhoods. But I think the insurance piece is key.
Hi, Tolga Morawski, Greater Mohawk Valley Land Bank. We cover the Mohawk Valley Red Sea, and we have some communities which were affected both in 2012 and 2013, including Schoharie County, which I'm sure you're familiar with, Montgomery County, Herkimer County, river flooding, runoff flooding, different things. And one of the things that has happened is, as we are a regional land bank and we have some money for demolitions, we have become kind of the demo of last resort. And that's been a frustration because we see two things. One, communities don't have the capital to do a lot of this work, which is reimbursement basis. So in some cases, we've worked with LISC to be able to go in and essentially do the demo up front and help, when the municipality is able to then recoup some of the cost. But what I think is also another concern is the selection process. One thing we've ran into in Ilion, New York, where we're working with demoing 13 buildings that are on a hill. So below the hill is the river, and all these properties were deemed flooded, and they were all demoed by under FEMA funding. But on the hill, where the houses were literally washed down the hill, the people there it was deemed a runoff event. So there was no flood money for them. And so a lot of these homeowners are caught in the middle where they don't have a way out. So what happened is these 13 property owners walked away from their mortgages, left their mortgages behind, and have liens still, 7 years later, hanging around their necks. And so what we're doing is we're working with the county to be able to go in and, in agreement, they're signing the properties over to us. We're going to demo them with Enterprise, and then the county is going to set aside those liens so they can move on with their lives. But the fact that as land banks, I know many other of us have dealt with this, that we're going in and kind of, pinch hitting, it seems like still the system is not really working in a holistic manner. So I was just wondering if there's any thoughts about that.
Very good question.
I mean, I think that's the bigger policy issue with buyouts too. It costs a lot of money, and a lot of money comes to the federal government, which has a lot of specific regulations that haven't changed since the 70s. So in order to help people in buyout areas or in areas that are flooded, potential buyout areas, I think the community really and state officials really need to start thinking about limiting building in these areas, talking to the community for a potential buyout when and if money comes, and working with land banks that if a homeowner is selling their property on the private market, that the state or another organization that has the funds can come and buy it and then wait until the other homes around it are buying it, so you can create that buyout area and create that buffer for the greater community. But again, it really all starts with it just costs a lot of money, and if you don't have that money, if you're not allowed to use that money, there's really not another option available to homeowners. And I think that's where, especially with Sandy, Maria, a lot of nonprofits like Enterprise and LISC, St. Bernard Project, are coming into communities that are affected by those large-scale disasters and implementing programs that they developed after the large-scale disasters. And I think that's really where that partnership needs to be built more.
I'm going to also pick up on some themes that I heard from Jamie and from Sam in particular about, in terms of this idea, which I think has been a theme throughout the whole conference, of how we integrate our responses and try and take more holistic approaches. So from Jamie, you were highlighting the disconnect that you were observing between comprehensive kind of planning and hazard mitigation planning. And Sam, you're really emphasizing community organizing and its connection to getting communities sort of in the driver's seat in both not only thinking about, but also implementing futures that they want to see. So do you see any connections between this question and, I assume you do, but.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the success that Push Buffalo had in Buffalo, and just to clarify, I just study what they do. I didn't do it. So Aaron Bartley was sort of the genius of this organization. So you can ask him if you have questions about kind of what he did, but I just study it, so I'm more free to add the exclamation points and tell you how great it is. But it was absolutely rooted in community organizing, and so they started by knocking on doors of every single person in this neighborhood and asking them what their issues were, what they wanted to see happen, and everything has been driven by that approach. And when they do the community planning, they go back to the neighborhood and do charrettes and do very extensive engagement. And that's one of the great keys to their success, and a part of the model that's in some ways the hardest to replicate, but the most important to replicate.
I'm going to push you before we turn to Jamie just a little bit. Why is it so hard to replicate?
So, in the 60s, housing organizations came out of advocacy movements in many instances. And then as they started getting federal and state and local money, not surprisingly, advocacy started becoming less and less a part of what they did, and organizing became less a part of it. So it's very hard to combine those two things. If you're doing community redevelopment, you're depending on government for your money. And if you're doing advocacy, you're protesting and rallying and picketing and telling government what they should do and all that sort of stuff. In Push's case, they stenciled pictures of Governor Pataki on the plywood of the house, boarded up houses in their neighborhood, and put his phone number. So there aren't that many groups that are willing to do that. But our hope is that when groups see that it works and that you can redevelop a whole neighborhood, starting with that approach, that more and more will emulate it.
I would just add that there's a perception with the municipalities that we spoke to that they are overlooked by the state. And so after a disaster, it's one of those times when money flows into one of these places. But I'm not sure if it's true that they're overlooked, but the perception is definitely there that they're overlooked, and it's probably true. So thinking about that moment as a moment of transformation for these places, James said, build it back better, I think those moments are really important. But if you're not ready with plans or you haven't really considered it, then there's going to be an issue because you need to make change fast and you don't have the plans in place to make the appropriate change.
I think what that is really important is to be talking to these communities before it needs to happen. One of the biggest issues also with a buyout is that a lot of these areas are inhabited by low and moderate income homeowners, and a lot of times, disproportionately, they're the people who are left behind in these areas because the buyout award offered they won't be able to get a mortgage, they won't be able to move somewhere. So the whole neighborhood of the fabric, or the fabric of the neighborhood changes, and it also leaves these people who are already vulnerable in a more vulnerable situation. So if you talk to these communities up front, people can plan, they can plan for where they could move to, how they could get additional funding, mortgages, staying in the same school district, same amount of time to go to work. But that's a really key issue, and I know that's been a big issue with FEMA buyouts also identified as an issue.
So David in Schenectady, just last weekend I took my son to the Spooktacular Festival in the new Gateway Plaza park that we have. This was a park that was impacted. It was like almost like a quarter-acre little pocket park before it's turned into an acre downtown green space. Had 3 buildings that were part of the buyout for FEMA, created a space that we've really invigorated that part of downtown because of this program. Now I'm looking at the slide behind us where it says property of Johnson City, no trespassing. We were lucky enough with that park project that we were able to layer on some state funding to build this park and some local funding to do this. And that, I think, was really important because at the end of the day, we all know this is important work, but if this is what we leave, and this is the reality of the FEMA funding, I know, and this may be what we need to talk about. If we don't sell this as an opportunity to make your city, your community, your town better, and we just leave it as, less property tax revenue, green space that's not accessible, that's not adding anything to the community, how successful are we going to be in continuing funding for these programs in the long run? Because we're not rebuilding anything that people feel good about. Maybe the funding, and I know it's again strict funding. We weren't able to. I think we were able to get the seed funded for the park project through the FEMA grant, but we could not fund any of the amenities that people actually would like in this place to make it an active park. But maybe the funding should be extended so that it's not just about clearing the houses out here, but it's about building in the right place that's going to build that sense of community that people are going to embrace this kind of work. So that's just a comment I had.
I think that's an excellent final thought to take into lunch with us, along with the general question that I've heard actually in this session and many others of how do we invest, and make decisions about where our investments both deal with the need that's greatest on the one hand and have the greatest likelihood of showing long-term success on the other. And sometimes those work together, but sometimes they're in tension. And I think we really need to grapple with that as a community involved with this. And with that, I'd like to thank our panelists and hope you keep talking about this during lunch.